of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C., and the author of a fascinating new book called Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America. Ilan, welcome to the program.
Oh, great to be here.
Well, this is one of those things. When I first got this book on my desk in preparation for the show, I had read a lot of things about Russia and knew that they had some problems. But the idea of those words, the end of Russia. I'm 55 years old. I can remember growing up with the Soviet Union foremost, the subject of the Soviet Union and communism foremost at countless dinner conversations with family. I remember arguing about it in high school, the Vietnam War, all those kind of things. And now you've written a book that suggests the possibility that Russia at some point in this century in which we're living could either cease to exist or change so dramatically that it's almost unrecognizable from the Russia we know today. Why don't you start laying out your case for that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, and also it's much more likely, just as a beginning comment, for it to be the latter, for it to be not the end of Russia in sum total, but certainly the end of the Russian state as we know it. And the reason sort of I make this case in the book is because there's a real dichotomy between the way you see Russia behaving abroad and what's actually taking place in Russia inside. Over the last couple of weeks, you've seen the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, really run circles around the White House in terms of how they approach Syria. Putin is jaunting off to Iran this week to solidify support for the Iranian nuclear program. And so there's a real sense that Russia's, at least internationally, on the march. But, there's that old political saying that says, if you have trouble at home, you go abroad. And I think that's exactly what's happening here, because if you sort of look past the hype and the mainstream media approach to Russia and look at what's actually happening inside the country, the picture is very different. Russia is at the intersection of sort of massive demographic decline, the rise of a growing and radicalizing Muslim underclass, growing economic and population pressures from China and its Far East. All these trends are sort of combining together to spell a transformation that's every bit as profound, or is going to be, as the transformation we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 decades ago.
Somebody who's just kind of a puzzle to me is Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. I don't even know how to ask this question, but what is he like as a person? I see him all the time. Every time I see a picture of him, he doesn't have a shirt on. He's hunting, or he's trying to kill something with his bare hands, or But he's also incredibly crafty. I mean, as you've mentioned, he's has apparently been playing the political game and the publicity game so well in terms of all this that's going on in Syria. The White House is embarrassed. I don't know if it admits it, but Putin, kind of advanced himself into the world stage and showed himself to be something of someone who can get something done. What is this man like in your, according to your understanding?
Well, Vladimir Putin is very much a product of the Soviet system. He grew up as a KGB case officer in East Germany. He cut his teeth on prosecuting dissidents there. He rose to power by throwing sharp elbows in politics in Russia's second city, St. Petersburg. He became president because he was the guy in the Yeltsin administration, the administration of the former president, that was most likely to give Yeltsin a clean bill of health in terms of not prosecuting him retroactively for corruption and things like that. So the way you see Russia is very much the way Vladimir Putin is. It's a cult of personality. He's built a larger-than-life persona, but it's one that's held together by massive graft, which he distributes to his loyalists, and also by strong-arm, deeply anti-democratic tactics.
How much of a remnant of communism exists in Russia? Is there a strong communist undercurrent? You mentioned his former KGB career, or is it just simply an anti-democratic ethos that exists in terms of Russian politics?
It's mostly the latter, quite frankly. If you look at the political health of the Russian Communist Party, the successor to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, it is not doing well by any metric. It's a marginal political force. There are politicians like Gennady Zhuganov, who's sort of the big one that everybody alludes to, but they're marginal at best. But what you do see is a larger trend line towards two things. First of all, towards sort of managed government. The Kremlin likes to talk about managed democracy, but it's not really managed democracy. It's a government system that really rules over most aspects of contemporary Russian life, and does so in a way that's deeply authoritarian. The other trend is a sort of a nostalgia for empire, right? Because the Soviet Union created a persona internationally that was very powerful, even though the economic conditions and the social conditions were deeply repressive at home. And a lot of Russians, are having trouble dealing with this diminished international stature today. And as a result, when Putin sort of outmaneuvers the White House on Middle East issues, or when he, summarily invades the neighboring Republic of Georgia, as he did a few years ago, that tends to resonate very well among the Russian electorate, even though his policies as a whole don't.
Russia has vast supplies of oil and natural gas. As you mentioned in your book, they supply the majority of those two energy sources to Europe. Do you think that if it had not been for that wealth of natural resources, that what you see, and we still haven't talked about some of the possible future scenarios for Russia. We haven't talked about those yet. We'll get to those in a moment. But do you think that whatever those things are, that they would have happened a lot sooner if it had not been for the vast wealth that Russia counted on through oil and natural gas?
Well, right. And Russia is, it's useful to understand, for all the listeners to understand, that Russia is a bona fide energy superpower. A few years ago, it surpassed Saudi Arabia in terms of total oil production. This is Russia's claim to fame in a very real economic sense. But it's increasingly a claim to fame that they can't make credibly anymore, and that's because most of Russia's energy wealth is localized in the country's east, where it's cold, it's inhospitable, and where the population is declining dramatically. And the Chinese influence and Chinese investments are rising. And so the very area that Russia is relying on to maintain its global status is increasingly becoming not Russian at all.
Well, and as you point out, people in Russia, now that they have freedom of movement, are moving west. And so they are voluntarily leaving Siberia and other eastern regions of Russia. So lay out for us a little bit of some of the possible scenarios in terms of conflict with China. Now, I know that, right now they act like they're, buddies because they work together maybe to frustrate U.S. policy. But is there a danger that at some point China, which is going in the opposite direction from Russia, might just simply take those regions that are so filled with natural resources?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer is probably not by force, and that's simply a matter of numbers. If you go out to western Siberia and the Far East, it's a cumulative territory of cumulatively something like 4 million square miles, and the population density on the Russian side of the border is something like 6 Russians per square mile. So, in a very practical sense, if the Chinese army marched across the border to fight the Russians, they wouldn't find any Russians to fight.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the conflict is not around the corner, but conflict can play out in very many different ways. Even if there's not going to be a military confrontation, you're seeing economic investment, migration, both official and unofficial, in the Far East that is transforming the region much more into a Chinese holding than it is a Russian holding. And that's what creates the potential for conflict, because the Kremlin understands the sort of places like Krasnoyarsk in the Far East are closer to Beijing than they are to Moscow. And as a result, the whole economy of the region is reorienting, and it's killing Russia's chances of being a global power in Asia in the process. And this is something that the Russian government really isn't contending with. But the future for Russia and China may be cooperation now, but very, very shortly it's going to be competition.
And if Russia were to, in one way or the other, whether it's armed conflict or some other, through some other process, if Russia was to lose those natural resources, what else? What other card can Russia play in terms of maintaining its status as a bona fide world power?
Well, and this is one of the areas where the danger to the West comes in, because if Russia is no longer, has a credible claim to being an Asian power, Russia will territorially move west, right? Because the Chinese will gobble up the Far East, and in order for Russia to remain in business in a real economic sense, it's going to need to acquire additional territories, oil-rich territories, for example, like the countries of the former Soviet Union that broke away 2 decades ago. And that sets up the potential for even more aggressive behavior on the part of the Russian government towards Eastern Europe, towards Central Asia, and a potential conflict with the countries of NATO.
So you see that as a real possibility in how many years? So what are we talking about? I know that it's hard to put an exact number on that, but what are we looking at in terms of the amount of time that Russia has left before it needs to start thinking of ways to reconfigure its, I don't want to say empire, but its nation?
Right. Well, it's hard to tell, but I certainly, these trend lines are manifesting themselves already. But in terms of real demographic changeover and a real sort of territorial changeover, you're looking at, a decade and a half from now. And the way you should watch this, certainly in the Far East, is to watch what China does. The Russians and the Chinese have actually been tussling over the territory of the Far East for centuries, and they only signed a border agreement demarcating, settling all their border disputes in 2001. The Russians at that time pressed very, very hard for the agreement to continue into perpetuity, essentially to solidify the border, not to have to worry about it again. The Chinese weren't willing to do that. They only signed an agreement that lasted for 20 years because they understand very well what the demographic trend lines are like, and they think in just a few years they're going to be able to revisit the issue completely.
Let me just, before we come back to Russia, and by the way, we're talking to Ilan Berman, who's vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council. We're talking to him here on today's issues on American Family Radio. We're talking to him about his new book, Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America. Let me just, something you just said, let me just take a little sidestep and then definitely want to come back to Russia. But China has always seemed to present sort of a puzzle for foreign policy experts, and it doesn't. This is what I hear. I'm certainly not an expert by any means, but I hear that you can't think like a Westerner when you're dealing with China. And something you mentioned just a moment ago seems to be the way China operates. And so I want you just kind of to deal with this. They seem. I don't want this to come off sounding racist, but they seem very crafty in their foreign policy, rather than simply thinking in terms of, well, we'll just use tanks. In other words, they seem to have a more subtle way of moving in terms of foreign policy. Because I would not have thought, with China growing the way it is, I would have thought, well, they should just take it if they want it. That's what they're going to do. You're talking about them saying, oh, we'll sign this agreement for 20 years because we're relying on demographics to give us something without firing a shot that other countries in other decades might have tried to take by force. Am I reading something into that, or is there something to that?
I think that's exactly right. Look, the Chinese are strategically patient, and they have a much more long-term view of global affairs than do everybody else. And you see this in the way they, for example, relate to the Middle East. When the Chinese officials are pressured on issues like Iran about holding Iran to account over its nuclear program, they always say you need to be patient. Let the process take time and to work itself out. And I think it's the same thing that they're doing here. The Russian government, by contrast, is very tactical. It's very short term. Putin and his followers are not in it for the long-term national greatness of Russia a century from now, 2 centuries from now. They're in it to aggrandize themselves now. And so China has an inherent advantage because it can simply outwit and outlast.
Well, let's move back to Russia and talk about Russia's Muslim problem. And you mentioned 2 things in your book. First is Russia's repression of Muslims. Let's start there, because when the former Soviet Union broke up, their southern provinces to a large extent were Muslim majority.